everyone, welcome, and thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Sophie Guo. I recently graduated with a PhD from the Porto, and this event has been organized in collaboration with my former colleagues, Diego Chitano, Assistant Curator, and Lottie Johnson, Curator, both at Barbican. From December 2022 to April last year, I served as a research associate on the exhibition project Unravel, the Power and Politics of Textiles in Art, currently on display at the Barbican until 26th of May. Please make sure to visit it if you haven't already. It's an invisible exhibition. In the limited and dominant narratives of Western art history, textile crafts, often dismissed as women's work, have often been relegated to the periphery, along with those who practice them. Today's event will explore how textiles and needlework possess the potential to queer, thereby destabilizing pre-existing categories of art, problematizing the gender binary, and serving as a key medium for feminist and queer injustice and liberation to see this. We're honored to invite artists L.J. Roberts and Sarah Zapata, whose work are in the exhibition Unravel, to be in conversation, moderated by our historian, Dr. Joseph McBrinn. Now I hand over to Diego, who will introduce our speakers tonight.
I'm just going to quickly introduce everyone and then we can begin. Thank you for coming today, and thank you to Sarah, LJ, and Joseph. So Sarah Zapata is a Peruvian-American artist whose work explores the spaces between cultures, time periods, craft, and fine art. As a crucial part of her heritage, Textiles allows Zapata to express herself in both contexts without compromising her personal identity. By working with traditional materials and techniques, the artist reaches out to her ancestors, the histories of her native countries, and the cultural practices that shape her contemporary reality. Zapata is currently based in Brooklyn, but not for long, and is an artist whose work is inspired by, like I said, her Peruvian and North American heritage, and exploring the spaces between these contexts. She engages with traditional and contemporary materials and everything in between, as well as various different techniques to interrogate the histories of labor, gender, and power. L.J. Roberts is an artist working in installation, textiles, collage, and text. Their practice addresses queer and trans politics, material deviance, alternative kinship structures, archives, and narrative. Textile is a strong thread in their work as they use the medium to address subjects ranging from creative communities and activisms to protest banners, the legacy of HIV and AIDS activism, historical queer houses, etc. Roberts is dedicated to expanding the possibilities for LGBTQI+ people and has collaborated with Visual AIDS, an organization in the USA that aims to open dialogues about the AIDS epidemic. Like Sophie mentioned before, both artists are within the exhibition at the Barbican Unravel, the Power and Politics of Textiles and Art, which is open from the 26th of May. And something that was really special for me, and I'm sure for my colleagues that worked on it, about this exhibition was the opportunity to bring together artists with interwoven histories and interwoven practices, and LJ and Sarah exemplify that. They're both good friends and have influenced each other, I'm sure, in ways that we will explore today. And we'll be able to explore this thanks to our moderator, who is Dr. Joseph McBrinn. Joseph is a reader at the Belfast School of Art at Ulster University and the author of Queering the Subversive Stitch, which is a survey exploring the underexamined history of men and needlework and how needlemen have subverted traditional ideas of masculinity. He has published extensively as well, and we would really encourage you to read this book and his other writing, which was really influential for us for the exhibition. yeah, and I think in this talk the idea is just to keep it like slightly informal and have some prompts, and I really encourage Joseph as well to. We gave a very general prompt, and I encourage them to challenge that prompt if they wish to, and to really explore it. So hopefully we'll get into that. But before we begin, yeah, I wanted to extend a huge thank you again to the three of you for coming and for participating today, and thank you to Sophie and the Courtauld for all their planning and their expertise throughout this. And yeah, thanks everyone.
Thank you, Diego. I just want to start by saying some thank yous. I just want to thank Sophie for organising this so seamlessly, and for Diego and Lottie for making us feel so welcome. We're very pleased to be here. Well, I am. So really, I want to begin the proceedings by just thinking about the title, this kind of statement that we have, this open mesh of possibilities. And this positioning of the word queer in textiles. And I just wanted to read something to you, if that's okay. So the word queer, I thought, actually really does matter, and how we position that and relate that to the idea of textiles is incredibly interesting and important. And I was thinking not just of the Unravel exhibition, which we've seen today, and if you haven't seen it, I would urge you to please go and see it. It is an incredible show. But I'm thinking of another show that happened in America in 2023, curated by the New York critic and curator John Chayach. And it's an exhibition called Queer Threads, which I'm sure you're familiar with. So it took place at the San Jose Museum of Quilts and Textiles in California. And it's an extension of a book and an exhibition with the same title that took place. I think the book was published in 2017 and the exhibition happened in 2014 in New York. And it was a survey of artists who work in ways which try to bridge these two kind of concepts of queer and textile. And one artwork in this exhibition by T.J. Dido Norris, entitled Toxic Shock, which was made in 2023, is a variation on an historic quilt. It's a wall-mounted artwork. It's a sort of fractured and reformed grouping of different fragments of cloth. But at the center of this artwork is a little label, and the label says made in China, distributed by Walmart stores, Bentonville, Arkansas. The label is stitched, machine stitched, and it's in both English and Spanish. And in a really great review of the exhibition in the Journal of Modern Craft by Nicole Archer, an American critic, she reflected on the exhibition, but also on this artwork and how possibly this idea of the label was quite significant. And she kind of mused about the idea of queer being a label and the idea of how it's been increasingly co-opted by various forces. And it did make me think, when I was reading her review recently, of Facebook, or Meta, I think it's called now, their recent development on Instagram of a new way of presenting images called Threads. So Archer suggested that the idea of the label was particularly pertinent to discussions of the idea of the word queer. And she suggested that rather than a label or even a noun, queer, like the word craft, really needed to be seen as a verb, as something that's an act, a process, a becoming, a doing rather than a being. And I just wanted to posit to posit the idea of labels, because I think queer is something that we see increasingly now in society as a term. And I just wanted to open our proceedings by asking our distinguished panelists about this idea of label. Is it possible to label? Is queer, is it a label? It's a big question.
I guess I have an answer I don't know if it's an answer, but the way that I think of the word queer is that, I mean, to talk about like mesh, a lot of the work that I did early on around textiles and queerness was thinking about queer and craft as what's called the deterministic screen, which is basically like, you know, when you take flour and you put it through the sieve and like some comes out and some stays back, and it turns out that what comes through is what you want, but what stays back is just as important as what comes through. It gives, you know, what the word doesn't mean is just as important as what the word does mean. And queer troubles that a lot because it's so inclusive of so many different things. And that's why I think it was so effective during the beginning of the AIDS epidemic, was because we were able to congregate and work together without being stigmatized as one thing, which was so harmful during that time. You know, craft, I guess, in textiles also works in a similar way, where in the United States, at least, when I was in grad school, and I think it's in my work a little bit that I put in the slideshow, but institutions were dropping the word craft from their names because it was so stigmatized in the US. It was considered very amateur and low. And to me, there was a lot shared with the word queer, like it has like this loose mesh, so craft can mean someone at a craft fair, or it can mean someone who's blowing glass, or it can be what we do, or it can be like my, you know, niece making a pop filter. But I think that leaving those words as something that's like loose and flexible, and I always see it as a place where those words exist on the margins and challenge the center, and then after they challenge the center can move back into the margins again, and that being a very productive space.
Yeah, I would agree. I think, I mean, language is so bizarre. We love it. It's so important, but it also, I think, is so testament to time. And so I think that certainly queer in itself, for me, even just in my life, it's changed so much. I think initially when I was first like able and like coming into my own, queer very much felt like a way of honoring activism in the United States, especially that goes back to how LJ mentioned as well what started about with the AIDS epidemic in the United States, where people were, they didn't want to associate as gay. It wasn't happiness, it was about the strangeness and the power that exists within queerness. And I think that that is something that I continue to think about. But of course, there's the whole memento mori situation of naming something, it's killing it. And so I think that, just as you're saying, there's so much that's said with what something means, but also what it doesn't mean. Mm-hmm. I think that's really important. And I absolutely agree. I think that extends to craft. I think both terms are stigmatized, but there's so much power that exists within that. And I think that that's also what continues to be such a rich dialogue between queerness and craft, because there are very specific connotations, there's very specific currencies that I think are able to be broken down with these terms.
I think you sent us a bunch of prompts with Sedgwick, and I feel like Sedgwick called craft or queer as always having like a consistently dirty underbelly. Isn't that one of the terms?
Yeah.
And I think about that, and one of the things I like to talk about when I like give artist talks is, so I was born in 1980 and I grew up outside Detroit, and there was just no vocabulary for like any kind of queerness whatsoever. There was nothing. And like I was a very like picked on, outcast, bullied kid. And a lot of the things that were wrong with me were like I was a fat kid, and I was like, you know, kind of like a rough and tumble kid, and I thought really differently, and I was always in trouble, and you know, a lot of like what was dysfunctional about me actually ended up being like the things that were most productive later. And So I think like in terms of this kind of label or going into the mainstream, you know, we could maybe look at that, but I think that there are plenty of people who are still like in that dirty underbelly having a good time. I am.
Yeah, I do think it's really important to point out that language is a very slippery thing, and that's what's interesting about these terms in a way. They're more kind of concepts than terms, and I like the idea that Archer was kind of arguing this idea of they're always about actions or about beings or about becoming. And Sedgwick, yes, Eve Kosofsky Sedgwick, in an essay in her book Tendencies in 1993, sort of first used this idea of trying to not pin down, but trying to answer, I suppose, what, you know, why people were using the term. And of course, it comes from a moment in the 1980s of reclamation of an identity and a community. And certainly I'm older, our panelists. And I do remember the use of the word wasn't just derogatory, it was a type of violence in a way. It was, you know, inherent in the word. And I think that's what's so important about kind of maybe beginning by thinking about language. Because what we see is Edgewick showing that it's not repurposed, but she talks about how things can be made, but they can also be unmade and remade. And she talks about how queer can refer to, it doesn't have to, but it can refer to this open mesh of possibilities, these gaps, overlaps, dissonances, resonances, lapses and excesses of meaning when the constituent elements of anyone's gender or anyone's sexuality aren't made or can't be made to signify monolithically. And I think just being able to capture just the historical kind of shift of what these things meant is actually an incredible thing. And she goes on further to say that queer really seems to hinge much more radically and explicitly on the individual, on not so much defining oneself through a label, but this understanding that you're undertaking a particular performative acts of experimental self-perception and affiliation, by which she means I don't think you're performing a particular conscious set of traits or performing identity. I think it's almost like a type of self-awareness. So I think it's interesting that she uses the textile metaphor in her essay. The essay is called Queer Now, and it's in this book Tendencies. And I was just wondering if our panelists could maybe sort of talk to us a little bit about how they came to textiles, is it something that made sense in terms of being queer to go into a practice which had that slippery term, conceptual kind of umbrella, and the particular type of textiles. Textiles, of course, is a huge concept, isn't it? It involves industrial textiles, things that are really harmful for the planet, and fast fashion, all those huge, fast things that dominate our lives. But there's also this space, as you were talking about, or this place where you can gain awareness for. But what's your experience with textiles? How did that come to be part of your practice? Is it initially something you started out with, or is it something that came anyway?
Shall we get a little visual?
Yeah. Yeah.
Let's get visual. Get the party started. So I was actually taught how to knit and sew by my grandmother when I was 7. So like a lot of people, matrilineal skill sharing. She learned from her mother, who was a Jewish refugee from Ukraine, who supported the household as a seamstress. So it was passed down, it skipped my mother, who will take her shirt to get a button dried, sewed on at a dry cleaner. So skipped that, and I got it. And I hated knitting and sewing as a 7-year-old. It was a rough practice. But and then like I mentioned, I grew up outside Detroit. It was a pretty rough area to grow up in as a queer child and as a queer teen. And I ended up leaving home at 13. And from there, I ended up at a boarding school in Maryland outside Washington, D.C. And there was a field trip to go see the AIDS Memorial quilt it was being laid out for the last time in full on the Washington Mall because it had gotten so big. And I was the only person on the field trip. And I remember walking around this quilt, and it was completely devastating to see about how many people who had passed away. And I was very aware of AIDS and HIV through like a family situation, but also I was having sex ed. It was like 1993, and basically they were like, if you have sex and if you are homosexual, they didn't even say that. They wouldn't even say homosexual because it like didn't exist where I lived. Like, you will die. And I was like, great, I'm never going to have sex with anyone. Like, terrifying, right? But I also walked around this quilt and it was like, oh, I see that there are subcultures. I see that there's vocabulary. I see that there are words. And that was a really big moment for me. And my first piece of queer ephemera ever was a Names Project t-shirt that I would wear in my dorm room by myself when no one was looking. And then it was taken away from me 6 months later. And then I ended up going to college. I was an English major, and I was studying critical literary theory and poetry. And I finished my degree early, took sculpture classes, and I had started just immersing myself in art, but I was learning a lot about ACT UP and Grand Fury and House of Color, Fierce Pussy, and like I was out, but I had to tell my mom, who's the character, and wasn't real happy, so I knitted this Mom Knows Now and climbed this tower illegally and like hung the banner off the tower so she would really know that I was queer. So I actually didn't start showing in museums and galleries, but this was done when I was about 21 in undergrad. And at this time I was like very involved in HIV activism on campus, like marching, organizing safe sex events, organizing safer sex events, organizing testing. And then this comes back to our earlier conversation. My first year in grad school was at California College of the Arts. This is like, I want to give you a quick overview of my practice because I am old and I've been doing this for 20 years. And my practice is like varied. I do a lot of different things, but California College of Arts and Crafts had dropped the word crafts. So I knitted it in bright orange yarn, and the day of open studios, snuck out the longest ladder I could find with two friends, got up there with E6000 glue. I don't know if you know what that is, but it's like you're never getting anything off. And put this up there, and people like lost their minds because the school I went to was very invested in crafts. But I think this is a good example of like practicing textiles to understand the stigma, but also the power and how those two things work together really well. But yeah, really fun to illegally climb buildings. I didn't know they were filming a promotional video for the school the next day, so they were thrilled with me. I just want to talk about this project very quickly because I was told I made work too slowly in graduate school. I still make work very closely right now, or very slowly, because my show at Hales was just postponed because I made so much work for myself. But advisor introduced me to using toy knitting machines, and so I do a lot of work still actually on a Barbie knitting machine and on a machine called a Cool Quarter for ages 8 and up, and these like sock making machines. So this whole fence is made by toys, like toy knitting machines and hand woven. This is a piece, it was actually in the first Queer Threads show. It's now in the collection of the Renwick at the Smithsonian, but it maps all of the queer collective houses in Brooklyn during the year 2010. Based on a map drawn by Rosa Lane Levitsky. It's also knitted on all the toys, hand quilted in the center. There's a detail, and what it does is on each of the pink triangles, there's a small button, like the kind you get at music shows, punk shows, and it has an illustration of, or it has the name of all of the houses and then an illustration that represents it. So like Denison got a leather daddy Satan, and Handsome Transom was a houseboat in the Gowanus Canal that got an anchor, and Glitter House still exists, it got a unicorn, but there's a lot of Felix Gonzalez Torres that shows up in my work, so these buttons you can take and they're replenished, so they, I just actually got an email that was like, I lost my button and I need one. So I had to contact the Smithsonian to be like, do you have a button? And I got that. After I made that piece, I didn't have a studio, so I started embroidering portraits of my friends, and I can do this anywhere, so camping, riding the subway. The top photo is me getting ready for Pride in Stockholm. I have a lot of feelings about like queer representation because portraits are so, they only represent a body, and I mean, they represent the body, and I think it's really important to see people. I didn't see what queer people looked like till I saw Catherine Opie's photos as like an older teenager, which were really important to me. And I never wanted to make representational work because I was just like, this body's really hard to live in. Why would I want to do that? Why would I want to make portraits? And then I was like, oh, it's really important to see queer people. But at the same time, these portraits really resist, oops, I didn't put the back of Nick Now's, but a lot of them are my collaborators. So we made a film together on Cherry Grove, which is like a gay vacation spot outside New York. This piece is in the Barbican show. This is my friend Frederick Weston, who unfortunately passed away in 2020, but I encourage you to look at his work. It's incredible. This was when we marched in Pride with visual aids, but then I also showed the back of the work. So the embroideries are between glass and framed. You can see them at the Barbican. And so for me, the representational and the abstract are the same piece, and it collapses the binary between representational and abstract, which is a non-binary person, really satisfying. And sometimes I think the back of the portraits are like even more evocative of who these people are to me and themselves than the recto is. Oh, here's Sarah in your studio. We live 2 blocks away from each other. So I made this portrait of Sarah. I guess I finished it during the pandemic, and then this is the back.
And that one of those rugs is actually in the show at the Barbican,
Oh,
which is
how lovely. So this is framed if you haven't been to the show yet. And this is the back, and in a lot of shows you can turn them, but I think we've stopped that practice. There was one of the glasses broken once. This is, I made 26 of these portraits. This is installed at Pioneer Works. So you can turn all of them to see the front and the back, made over the span of 10 years. And we made a book that functions in the same way of the show, where you can see the front and turn the page to see the back. I also make huge works. So this is like I'm so like US centric, I apologize, 22 feet high and 14 feet wide. It's huge, but also like knitted on all the children's toy knitting machines. It's a lot of my friends, it's kind of like the queer collective houses brought into conversion vans. So there were like vans that friends had. There was like Praline Dream and the Trojan Pony, and they would kind of be these informal spaces of community, but also economy. Like you would trade an oil change for having your art transported somewhere, or they would take a performance troupe around the country. And I really like thinking about like combining queer histories. So there was a lesbian separatist group called the Van Dykes in the 70s that would like blow up each other's vans if someone slept with someone's girlfriend, but they like didn't want to be land-based. And then this kind of like current van culture that combined a lot of like other queer identities and they were used as these kind of, like I said, de facto community spaces. And then I also was thinking about the future because I'm from Detroit. There's a lot of cars. I also worry about the apocalypse. So I was watching like Born in Flames or Stranger Things. And there's really great time travel back from the past to the future and back again. These are details. So the taillights are hacked light brights. All of the words are done with shoelaces. I really like language a lot, so the van has its own language. My favorite being van tankerous over the gas tank. But you can see like vampire and vanifesto. This took 6 years to make. And this was actually a show Sarah and I were in together at Museum of Arts and Design. We shared the floor, so you can see, I work on the floor. You can see it in process. And then I put this in at the end. I'm now making like a lot of these bigger quilted pieces, but the bigger quilted pieces have these small embroideries in them, so I'm like officially totally nuts. But I also do these light box pieces because I've always had a photography practice. And this piece is really important to me, and I actually see it very connected to my textile work, even though people are like, wow, this is so different, LJ. But it's on Stormy DeLabriere, who is a mixed race butch from New Orleans, who came to New York as a 13-year-old and sang with the Apollo Review as a drag king and was a bouncer at lesbian bars, queer bars, 2 of which still exist, the Cubbyhole and Henrietta Hudson. It's kind of a longer story, but it had to do with Stonewall being declared a national monument and her story being very erased from those articles. So I'm very interested in kind of bringing the ghosts into the room of past figures, but it started with this terrible correction. I'm obsessed with reading the New York Times, flawed as it may be, that put this really offensive correction up after saying Stonewall was like led and entirely enacted by gay cis men. But this piece feels also just very connected to my work. I've made more pieces like this recently, and it will be up at the National Portrait Gallery this summer through World Pride and possibly another year. So it'll be on view. And now I think it's you. Was that good enough to say how I got into all of this?
I think that clarifies it
This
for us.
tangle, to use a textile metaphor.
I was just struck by the 6 years of making a piece. That's quite extraordinary.
Ask my partner about that.
Where do you?
That's who really counts the clock.
Yeah.
Partner.
Uh-oh, it just went off. Wait, is it back?
I think you're.
Oh no, tech difficulties.
I know.
I jostled something that got unplugged.
We're back.
Yes.
Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, LJ, for sharing so much. And it's so incredible seeing your work again. I feel like it all makes so much sense, and it's beautiful to see how varied you're thinking about textiles and how differently too I think both of us are thinking about them, but also the same. And so I really just wanted to talk about, I think, the work that's at the Barbican right now. And so these were sort of the sketches that I made initially for these works. I came to Textiles, I'm originally from Texas, my father is from Peru, my mother is like a white evangelical Christian from Texas. So it was a strange upbringing and sort of like not understanding exactly where I fit in. And so textiles were like a way for me to kind of navigate in between the two. Obviously, Peru has an incredible history of textiles. My grandfather back in Piura, he had a fabric store, as well as it being a part of the matrilineal line. And then with Christianity, there's biblical text that talks about how a woman is good, she works with her hands, and it's a way to honor God. And as well, like, I truly hated being a child, and a way that I really was able to navigate that, I hated Texas, and was just going to thrift stores and really kind of making clothes any way that I could, cutting them up and painting them and hot gluing before I learned how to sew, because I felt like there was so little that I could control, but that was the one thing that I could control, like how my body moved through space. And so it was a way, I think, to operate in a lot of different arenas, as well as just seeing that I could exist on my own terms in this in-between space. And so I think the in-between is really something that I'm always trying to lean into. And so with these works, I had done, like my first installation And when I had been asked to be a part of the exhibit with LJ, it was basically celebrating the residency at the Museum of Arts and Design in New York. And they invited 4 artists to have our studio in the museum. So it was a very strange public situation. I have said this, and I continue to, if it weren't for LJ, I don't know if I would have gotten through that. The museum is literally at Columbus Circle, and so it was just a very bizarre situation. But at the same time, I think that it was really important for viewers to see work that's unfinished. I think that that was really illuminating, and also kind of thinking about what goes into textiles. I think a lot of people don't understand the mechanics of it. And so this was sort of the first generation of these works. I really honestly did not know what I was doing. The first installation that I had done were with all of these rugs and these sculptures that were based off of the Paracas mummy bundles. And so I really wanted to think about how to create these in-between spaces with rugs. I really came to rugs after I moved to New York after school, and kind of really being unsure about the work that I wanted to make. I had studied textiles in Texas, but when I moved to New York, I was really embarrassed by it. I didn't know anyone who was working in it, and it felt like this really strange endeavor. And it was really through this writing practice that I had of writing lesbian foot erotica, where I was able to sort of digest what my life had been like before in Texas, and being an out person for the first time and being away from such an evangelical culture. And feet are this incredible part of the body where in the Bible it's a symbol to talk about your trajectory through life. It's a sign of humility. It's also this fetishized part of the body. And with textiles, it's so related to the body. I wanted to be in charge of exactly how it related to them. And so that's how I really started thinking about rugs. And upon further investigation, they're this really incredible symbol in South America and Peru specifically, where textiles weren't used on the ground prior to the Spanish colonialization. But now they're seen as this very ubiquitous object from this part of the world, when really they're symbolic of political erasure and change. And so I really wanted to think about how the rug could move throughout the space and exist in this in-between space. And so literally making these ruins with these textiles. And I wanted them to be referential of a latch hook rug. It's a very simple technique that's literally just knot making. And so thinking again about this currency of textiles and craft, and something that's considered too accessible to the point that it's not allowed to be intellectual. And so how to really think about this technique that's also very ridiculous and can take on its own life in this way. And so it really took quite a few years for the work to be realized. This is me reading with the work throughout, and I'm still doing this with now. I have so many installations, I've been restaging them and changing them. And so this was for a performance that was at MoMA PS1, and I was reading some lesbian foot erotica in the installation with a video of my feet interacting with the sculptures. And so prior to the pandemic, the work was meant to be touched, and it was very much a part of that and giving that sensuousness to the viewer, whereas now I'm seeing that video as a way to activate the space because it's no longer hygienic / better for conservation. So this was the first sort of proper restaging. I had shown it at Boston University when I should not have. It was a mess. I tried to find images. I think I literally deleted them from my archive. But I think it's also important too. I think failure is something that I continue to find in my work, and how it continues to evolve and be important. I think that obviously when you're making work for spaces, you can plan and have everything mathematically correct, but you're never going to know exactly how it responds to it until you really see it in the space. So this was for a group show in New York. And so I really wanted to think about these ruins, and they were really based off of altar clause as well, and really this idea of it being the altar is sort of the heart of the liturgical space, but it's a traditionally male space. And so thinking about the altar cloths adorning these with this traditionally male space, with this traditionally female work, and that sort of subversion, and then relating to the title, which is to teach or to assume authority. And that goes back to biblical text talking about women are not to teach or to assume authority, and thinking about these as altars, but also as ruins. And so they're based off of these ruins that were found in southern Peru, in Cahuachi, where there was found one of the largest pieces of cloth. It was, I believe, around 60 meters long, and it was this incredible, baffling object where archaeologists didn't know that these people were using looms to weave cloth for yardage, but it also was this incredible symbol of this community of women working together to achieve a singular goal. So thinking about a lot of these lineages and how they could be existent within this idea of like imagined time. And so this work was collected by the Stedelijk, and so that I think was also an interesting change for the work because it's sort of been crystallized in this final form. I think as long as I still have possession of work, I'm still changing it, and every time that I install it, it becomes something different. And so now it's funny to see it that this is very perfect and specific and punctuated, whereas I think it also is able to live in this way, but in a different regard. Oh, and this is at the Kemper. I guess I don't need to talk about this, but I had the privilege of doing some work at the archives of the Gay and Lesbian Archive of Middle America in Kansas City, and was able to research this lesbian community there called Womantown, and thinking about world building. But I think that I digress necessarily, but yeah, I think I can just leave it there. I forgot what I put in here, so I'm so sorry. This is just other work, but basically these were supposed to be column works, and again, I'm showing them in different ways, so perhaps that was my initial thinking of how I'm changing these works, but speaks to the incredible plasticity that is textiles. They can be shown in so many different ways. Wow, I just kept going.
Thank you. I think you've answered all my questions. I have no more questions for you. Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting, isn't it? I think when you see the images, in some ways they also speak to art history, not in a conscious way. We think about the history of abstraction, in particular. We think about Mike Kelly, those type of artists as well. Was this something that was in your mind, or is it just
I think
one of those accidents when you see it?
Yeah, I think subconsciously, and now when I first moved to New York in 2011, I think it was 2012 that there was like a huge retrospective of Mike Kelly at MoMA PS1. The entire museum was Mike Kelly, and I remember seeing that work, and it was very transformative. And I think that that was like very much in the back of my mind that I didn't realize until later, especially the first sort of like installation work that I did. I think indirectly sort of referenced that work. But I think it also comes from a different angle. I think that it's important for me to make all of the work, whereas I think he did incredible work of like taking these ready-mades and honoring them. But I think that's also important too. There's this like specific currency with textiles that you're not supposed to cut them up, and he very much did. And I feel like I like to do that as well.
Yeah, so there are particular things with individual artists that speak to you, in this journey of engaging with textiles. Is it something you're both conscious of, predecessors or inspirations, or visually we've seen the AIDS clothes and it's such an extraordinary thing. Are there particular things, I suppose, heritage, cultures that you're immersed in? And what I found quite interesting when I was reading about your work was this Christian, religious, Orthodox Jewish kind of contexts that you come from. I thought that was really fascinating because I think those are things that aren't talked about in contemporary art in a way. The spirituality, those dimensions, because they're there. I was quite fascinated that you come from a town, Sarah, in Texas called Corpus Christi. I was amazed by that because it means sort of body and blood of Christ in Christian symbolism. It's extraordinary, isn't it? So it was a pretty intense Christian place, I'm assuming.
Yeah, it's true. I think that Yeah, I think it's important to think about. It's also too, I think it's sometimes the pervasive culture that exists within the United States and especially in the South. So I think that for me, I kind of had a choice in my life where it was like, should I deal with this and die doing that and like be weighed down with this, or sort of like reappropriate this, because also I'm not unusual. And I think that there's so many people that have come out of Christianity, particularly evangelical, and how to kind of like see how to make that more powerful for you. So I think that that's been incredibly important, and I think that there's so many congruencies with textiles and spirituality. I think that just as people have been needing to clothe themselves, they've been questioning where they come from. And so of course there's going to be these really similar lineages, and I think that's what I love so much about traditional textiles, especially from Peru. But I think that what I love about them is how they would use them. They would use them as documents. They would use them as a way to punctuate one's existence, and how they were some of the most incredible abstract works as well. And I think that those are still incredibly contemporary. So I think too, it's about this conversation that exists ultimately between material and time.
Yeah, I agree. It's really fascinating, the elastic kind of ways in which these things kind of connect. One thing that you both kind of talked about is this idea of the archive. You know, I suppose if you grow up queer, you don't have access to the past. It's erased, and many theorists who write about the idea of queer talk about how it isn't in the present. It's always a sense it's in the future, or it's in a time that we're kind of constantly going into or trying to become. So the archive, is that something that you're kind of aware of? Obviously you've done work with a specific archive, but museums collect work, museums codify work, museums think in those terms. Do you keep archives of your own work? I'm just interested with artists. How does that work?
You can take that.
I keep archives of my own work. I guess I have a lot of archives of, I mean, not so much, I guess. I'm not, most of my pieces, I really want them to live in the world. And that's been really important to me, because I know that my work, I don't know how to state this without it just being like an after school special, but like I get emails all the time from young queer people and older queer people that are like, I saw this work and it helped me like not kill myself today. Like I've gotten 2 of those emails, and to me that is like what I am trying to do is very much speak to a population that I feel very connected to, and my growing up experience, my teenage experience, the experience I'm still having is very much of one of like needing to connect. So I would say that my work, like I don't want it to live in the archive. I really want it to be into the world so that those dialogues can happen, or that someone can just have this experience of being like, I look like this microphone or person. Or, like for me, working on the Stormy de la Brie project, like if I had known about Stormy de la Brie as a 13-year-old, how would my world been different? If I had known about this like butch that walked around the West Village, like protecting everyone, taking care of people who were dying of AIDS in the 90s, singing as a drag king, like having this beautiful life. For me, like being in that archive with all of those articles and knowing that she had been erased, I was very determined to bring her back into the room. And the project I'm working on now, I actually, I had a brilliant researcher who was a friend of mine compile a huge archive of queer and trans auto mechanic shops in the United States from the 70s to the present, because I love cars, but also cars are really important right now, because like if you need an abortion in say Texas, you got to get in the car and go somewhere. And if your car is not working well, you're going to have an issue. And if you're a queer person who works into like some dude's mechanic shop and gets treated badly, you have an issue driving someone to get an abortion. So like having queer and trans mechanic shops, like I was just like, oh, this is the coolest thing that ever existed. And that archive is like newspaper articles, photos, classified ads, personal ads. It's like, I'm a mechanic and a Pisces, and I'm looking for another mechanic who's a Capricorn. It's like, you know, and so for me, you know, I will also show those kind of archives with my work. But, you know, I think that having it be alive in the world makes us, meaning like lots of different kinds of people, also alive in the world, and that is paramount to me in this moment.
Yeah, I think that the archive is something that is so important, especially as queer people and as, for me, as a lesbian as well. I think that so often lesbians are erased. And so I think that it's so true. Like, I love what you said, where how would your life be different knowing about Stormy?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's too what's so important, and like our job also of like keeping these memories alive, keeping these people alive, and making sure that they're not forgotten. And also I think it's important too where like there's this farce of an idea that like queer people are new, and that's not true.
Yes. I was gonna say your work is like, we've always been here.
We've always been here, exactly. And I think that that also speaks to like in your book, Joseph, as well, like also what's so important. And when I think that's when labeling is important, because it's like a historical situation. And I think that that's like so important. Even the work that I briefly showed, where I was researching this like lesbian commune within like a city within a city in Kansas City. Basically, like at the opening, it was in Kansas City at the Kemper Museum there. So many people were like, we had no idea this existed, and they had lived in Kansas City their entire life. And so I think too, even just being able to have these things be remembered. I love the internet, it's incredible, but it's also extremely revisionist. And I think that there's so much that gets lost in the cracks. So it's like also important to be in the archives and like see what is getting lost.
Yeah, I think, I mean, you both spoke to that so well, the whole idea of the queer archive is something that's different from what we kind of broadly understand as archiving, because it is a reclamation of a way of seeing ourselves in a way. So queer archives, what about queer writing, queer theory? I'm just interested in kind of how you kind of take that relationship. I know you both write, you both talked about the theoretical frames which you've drawn upon, and you both explicitly showed that idea of queer theory and its relationship with craft, that porousness in these terms that we kind of began with. But do people read queer theory? I mean, is it something a lot of artists read? I'm interested.
Yeah, no, I think it's important. I mean, Jose Esteban Munoz is like, you know, mother, if you will. I think reading, like Feeling Brown, Feeling Down was like transformative. And I think that just, of course it's dense, but I think that that also like is exciting. You know, I think it's not a reading necessarily where you're like tearing through a novel. It's like, for me, it's something you're really able to like take time and really like live in this text and contemplate it. And perhaps you never finish the book. It's just like this thing that lives with you. And I think that that's what's so important about writing, and why also writing was such a foundational thing for me as well. Starting out as a young artist, like I had no money, and I wanted to access fantasy in a way that I couldn't physically, but with writing I could. And so I think that that is something that continues to be really powerful, and just unloading and unlocking things in your mind that like you never would have contemplated. So I think that queer theory is really important. I understand why perhaps it's not for everyone, but I think that that is also important as well.
I think it's a personal thing in a way, isn't it? How you kind of connect to reading But there's something about these theoretical texts which were really transformative on a generation.
Yeah.
And I think that it's hard to teach it. It's hard to kind of, draft up a curriculum, and I don't think that's the right way to do it. I think it is much more how you find things. And the interesting thing I find is the kind of the way certain texts then prompt you to work. And you're right, what you said, Sarah, the idea that this reading isn't like work. It's a different type of reading in a way. But there's a lovely line in Eve Kosofsky Sedgwick, I think it's the epistemology of the closet, where she talks about at the end saying, well, I hope people reading this will feel they have a right then to tell their stories or to think through what they've been through, to make that, to air that so we can understand and learn as well. And I just thought it was a very generous and generative way to think about, writing. But LJ, you've written quite a lot about the sort of frames of queer theory as a model for craft practices and textiles as well. That idea of, how you can conceptualize and contextualize what you do with text. Mm-hmm. It's interesting. And in fact, it's an incredible essay from 2011 that was published in Berlin in Maria Busak's book. It's incredible. But is it something that you came to? How did you come to these type of texts? Was it in an educational context or?
Well, I was an English major, so I was studying critical literary theory through English and poetry. And I mean, I feel like I was a book nerd as a kid, and my actual introduction to like queer anything was reading Toni Morrison's Sula, which has this like extra hot scene in it. And then, and I was like 13, so I was like, but I was reading Toni Morrison, I was reading Dorothy Allison, later I was reading June Jordan, like lots of like women of color and Black women who were like actually being very forthright about possibilities, and that's kind of what got me into thinking about. And then in college I read Invisibility Blues by Michelle Wallace, whose mother is Faith Ringgold. So I was actually introduced to Faith Ringgold by reading Invisibility Blues. I feel like honestly writing that essay, when I wrote that essay when I was a master's student and I was very young and I had no idea what I was doing. And it was like actually sort of a traumatic experience. And I felt like I've only realized how much backlash there was to that essay very recently, through like thinking back certain experiences and interactions I had with people, which basically like reimagines craft identities using neo-Nazist theories of disidentification. I haven't written academically since. And my practice is very much how I write now, because most of my work has text in it. And I consider myself like a totally deviant poet who writes off the page and through being deviant with material. I don't get to read as much as I like because I'm like constantly stitching and like gnawing off my fingers with my needles. But, when I do read now, it's like completely to escape reality that we're living in. So I'm reading I was reading a lot of N.K. Jemisin kind of stuff. And I do read I listen to a lot of like queer history podcasts, and, I'm much more interested now in like understanding history and how that has contributed to the present and what the future is looking, especially as like a middle-aged person, where I want to be reading what young people are also thinking, because that's really helpful for me, because so many, I was like, one of my students made this beautiful glossary of queer terms, and I was like, what the hell is agender? And I read it and I was like, oh, that's me. Thank you, Generation Z. But, so for me, like, I think that, yes, I definitely write essays still, they're much more personal. They like come completely from here. I mean, not completely, but like they're, you know, from the heart. Like I recently, not that recently, but I wrote an essay for Harmony Hammond's book launch, and she's been like a force in my life. So to be in a show with her right now is a big deal for me. So mostly what I write is, I write when I'm asked to write pretty much, and I write about things that feel very critically important to me at this moment. And I always work with a lot of urgency, so there's like a project that has to be done because of a certain situation, like I drop everything and start doing that, whether it's writing or art. But yeah, I mean, theory-wise, Heather Love's been important to me, particularly talking about, like, there's a line in Feeling Backwards about queer kinship being like one of the greatest achievements of queer people. And, you know, for me, the way that my kinship networks are at the moment, which have been very stressful in recent years, because I'm watching an older generation get sick. Like lots of people who have survived AIDS get like sick with other things and pass away. And so those like queer kinship networks, like I almost feel like that is a bigger part of my queer identity, or as big a part as like things that you would think of as like gender or sexuality or your race or like your all of those things that make up your queer identity. That lifestyle of like being very intertwined with the queer people in my life in a very intergenerational way is something that I live every single day in really beautiful, wonderful ways and very devastating ways also. So.
Maybe I could read you a quote again from Sedgwick. Sorry if I'm pushing Eve Kosofsky Sedgwick. But she writes about how queers as marginal figures in society patched together from fragments of community by usable heritage. And she talks about this as a politics of survival and resistance. And it's always very striking to me when I read these things how she talks about ideas through textile analogies. Now, lots of writers do, it's not that unusual, but it seems so perfect, it seems to make so much sense, and it's quite poetic. And it's very nice the way she often talks about herself in her books, how when she was writing certain things it damaged her career, how, you know, textiles were important to her because she was taught by her grandmother. So, and I think the human side of practices, of cultural practices, whether it's writing or making things, is what gives them longevity that other things just don't have, that gives them a power. But I was wondering about the idea of yourself, how you, because it's quite, I mean, I feel like I'm probing and asking personal questions, but it's that idea of opening yourself up, isn't it? Is that hard? How is that difficult? Because people know you now, you know, they know more than they say know about someone like me who's a historian. I don't talk about myself. You know, I was struck, you know, as you were saying, LG, about students bringing you things. And I've had lots of students over the last couple of years reading a book by a French writer called Edouard Louis, and he wrote a book called The End of Eddie, which is an auto-fictional account of his childhood growing up queer in France in the 1990s, I think. But he's part of a group of writers who pioneered this idea of writing their own histories, their own stories. Sometimes they're fictionalized, sometimes they're not. But it just feels sometimes intrusive. I don't know. How do you feel?
Ooh, I'm just kidding. I mean, I think it just comes with the job. I think, unfortunately, but fortunately, I think it also is important, like you were saying, like people reaching out to you and being like, thank you for doing this. I think that the positives outweigh the negative, in my opinion. I think there's also important to have boundaries. And the way that I like to think about my work, it's about me, but it's also not about me. It's about how my experience relates to larger societal constructs and how I'm not unusual. There are people who grew up Christian, there are people who grew up from immigrants, who grew up in all these different things, and how to really feel powerful within this in-between space. So, I mean, I think it's strange, but also it's not that strange now that we're living in this era of social media. I think that we all know things about each other that we don't say. So I think that that also has made it less pervasive in this way. So, but I think that ultimately it's important for us to talk about our existence. I think white straight men have been doing it forever, and so it's nice for people to see other people getting to talk about their lives.
I suppose you learn a lot, don't you, when you make work? Like, it's about thinking through work, isn't it, in a way? LJ?
I mean, certainly my life is extraordinarily intertwined with my art. And in certain ways, in terms of like what I disclose, in certain ways I don't feel like it's a choice, to be perfectly honest, because of the specific experiences that I've had. And part of that specificity has just been the fact that like everyone did everything they could to make me not queer, including like my last 2 years were spent in a therapeutic boarding school, which was like a step away from queer conversion therapy. Like it was that. And I vowed that when I got out of there that like no one was ever gonna do that to me again. So it wasn't a choice. Like I was like, the only way that I can be myself is to be like fully myself all the time in every moment. And that's for better or for worse. Like there is no facade, and that comes with a lot of, you know, I'm definitely a complicated human being at times and a very quirky one. And but you know, for me, because of how the intense pressure I went through, it's always, you know, I have seen artists speak who are like, I want to be really ambiguous and have this like quiet presence. And for me, if I'm quiet, I felt like if I was quiet, that there would be like this way of like completely muting me. And maybe that's not true. It's born out of like some kind of trauma, but yeah, I mean, I did come of age in this era where there wasn't the internet growing up. I like couldn't reach out and find support. And the way that I was able to find queer people was driving 4 hours to a bar for like a one night, like queer night, you know? Yeah, I hope that like other people are able to say, you know, I went through this or I didn't go through this, but it helps me like be in the world, and like not also to sound like an afternoon special, after school afternoon special again, but like it took me a long time to be happy to be in the world, and now I'm really happy to be in the world, and I never thought I'd get there. And art has been like the crux of doing that because it's given me a way to connect, and working with visual aids has been an unbelievable experience for me. In that community, I'm so grateful to all of those people. And I hope that I can like do service to contribute back to all that that community has given to me. Yeah, I don't totally know. Like, I mean, certainly my family is like not super psyched about certain things that I talk about, and like they get to hear that, and because of the choices they made.
I just wanted, I see the time, yeah, I see the time's coming to 1:15. I just thought I'd just maybe wrap up proceedings by maybe drawing the conversation to a close by asking about these words again, going back to words, but particularly craft in general and the idea of reparative. And Sedgwick very much talks about reading as a reparative act, how reading can help heal, you know, whatever trauma or suffering that you have. Is making the same?
Definitely.
Yeah.
I feel like absolutely. I mean, I even have like different like practices. Like I have like only my hobby making situations, and then my like practice. I think that making is extremely transformative and repairing, like literally and figuratively.
is it a textile thing? You know, I'm always curious about other craft practices, because textiles seems to have there's such a tactility with the material, and you seem to be so involved in a bodily sense.
Yeah, I mean, my like hobby is I like make my own clothes, and it's funny since that has really evolved. It's also like made me a much more confident sewer in my work, and it's made me much more like adventurous with like my weavings. And so I think that absolutely the dexterity is something that sometimes when it's just for fun, it can transform into something perhaps more edifying or additive.
Yeah, but it helps. It's kind of part of the whole idea of what it is. Mending is healing. Is it true? I think so.
Yeah.
I think possibly everybody's had some experience of making something and making themselves feel better. I think it's even an idea of language, isn't there? The idea that you make something.
Sometimes destroying the textile is really helpful.
Absolutely.
That was part of making it.
Oh, yes.
On making, etc. So I think we can really draw our conversation to a close. I'd like to thank you both so much for such
Thank you.
powerful and fascinating insights to your practices. Can we give our speakers a round of applause? Have time for questions? I think we do have the room till quarter past. So anybody has a question they'd like to ask? I think we've answered quite a lot. Oh, sorry, yes.
I just wanted to, in the context of that central quote on politics of survival and persistence, your views on the movement art and the Barbican exhibition, and the sort of in solidarity with Palestine due to the Barbican not hosting the winter review of books, winter lecture series, as a way to stand as practitioners of a very subversive craft.
Yeah, I can take that one. I think that I really appreciated how those artists were able to stand in their convictions. I think most of us are on the same side, and it's really important to use our platform to speak to that. And I think most, if not all, artists should be and are against censorship. And if anything, I think that it's a sign of where we are currently. I think that if anything, it made the show even more prescient and speaking to what the current reality is. I don't know how things are here in the UK, but in the United States, it's incredibly fractured. I think people are being punished on both sides. I think that there is also a witch hunt of sorts that's going on, and I think that there's a lot of misdirection that's happening. And so the fact that also the museum staff as well as the other artists were able to rally and participate in how that they felt best represented their politics, I think is incredibly important. And I hope that museums pay attention. I think that it's important to know that our work does not exist within a vacuum. And so if we're able to talk about these things that are perhaps uncomfortable, but they're extending the conversation outside of the museum, ultimately that's what we're needing to do in our jobs.
Yeah, I can speak to it a little bit too, and I'm just going to be extremely transparent. I have always been of the belief that if you have an event and you don't like something, then you show up and you dissent, and there should be open conversation about that. And I participated in a lot of those actions during college, and I've been an activist for a really long time and on the pavement, and I've been done lots of different kinds of activism, and some of it has been a success and some of it hasn't, and I've definitely also made mistakes as well. And I'm just gonna be real transparent, so you can hear this and you can think what you want. When there was a call to remove work by these collectors, they very aggressively emailed artists, and it was all over the press. And my partner can attest about how stressed out I was for 2 weeks, because I always believe in trying to do the right thing. But for me, so I sat there for like 2 weeks paralyzed, like totally stressed out. It was a mess because I didn't know what to do. And then I started talking to other artists in the show, and they were talking to other artists, and other artists were talking to other artists. And it became this thing where everyone was like, oh, you know, calling each other. And there are artists I didn't even know. Like, I'm talking to someone in Amsterdam, they're talking to someone in Venezuela, like that person's talking to someone in Indonesia. It was really an incredible network of people talking. Most of these people are women. I consider myself non-binary, but certainly I got put into that category. And, you know, we're talking about it and we're like, oh, like these two men are trying to shut down a show of mostly women and non-binary people and like women of color and women from the global south. Like that happens in fibers all the time. Like you're working with a stigmatized medium and like you're trying to shut down a bunch of artists who are talking about decolonizing and violence and gender and race. And wouldn't have been, you know, Sarah made this really beautiful statement about like being in the in-between areas, in the gray areas. And for me, you know, the situation has been intensely stressful for me. Like I have very different politics than my family. And it has caused estrangement and it's been horrible. And these in-between spaces are really important to exist in. And I thought that Ilan from Indonesia, like that action of saying, let's put this desk in front of the work, because curators all the time get put in these positions where they've done so much good work and they take the brunt of having their good work undone. To me, it's like, how can you take a show like this and connect someone at a trans march to what is happening in Israel and Palestine? Because that white supremacy that tried to undo my body and make me quiet is that same white supremacy. Hands down. I'm fighting for my body and my life against people that want to stifle my gender because of assimilation into something, because of a bad reaction to trauma and all these complications. Therefore, isn't it just much more productive? Like I was like, there should be a whole curriculum to go through this show to understand how all of this work relates so that people who think they are not connected to this conflict can understand how they are. Why shut down a show when you can use it to make those connections? So when, and also just like, I'm like, leave it to two men to like shut down a bunch of people who've not had to have a voice for so long. You know, I think censorship is abhorrent. In the United States right now, the fact that I'm like, do I protest or do I get shot by a far-right protester? Because that's what happens in the US, both in Charlottesville and in Wisconsin. The fact that they're like expelling students from protesting on campuses, I've never seen anything like that before. So, you know, there's also this consideration of, I think institutions not only need to not cancel events, but they need to make them safe for people to have dialogue. And that's where I'm at with it. Thanks, sorry if that was really intense, but like, it's an intense time.
Yeah, it's important.
You know, it's an intense time and making those connections is important.
I have a question for LJ on alternative kinship structure. You touched on that briefly. I'm just wondering if you could say a bit more about how textile work or your work in general, more broadly, imagine an alternative kinship structure that is non-patrilineal and non-heteronormative.
In terms of how they form and how
Yeah.
they work. I mean, for me, it's been a lot through like my community that is involved with HIV and AIDS. Both like long-term survivors of HIV who are living and I like, we call them my men. They're like, I have this like lovely group of like older men that I've connected with, and then I have like a whole trans community and that are like my age, and then you know, a lot of my students end up, after they've graduated, like becoming part of the network. And, you know, I think that a lot of it was like a lot of fear that my biological family wouldn't extend the care that I needed, and that there was like a reciprocation that was really important to me in terms of like extending that to my community, and also like making sure that we were all taken care of, because so many people had experienced that in there's a common experience of, I think specific to New York City, to be perfectly honest, had come to the city as like this place to be. And I certainly moved to New York City to like live the life of a queer bachelor. And even though I'm partnered, we call each other spinsters together. So yeah, I mean, it's like, I mean, I remember in the worst of the pandemic, it was like we were checking on each other, and I was like dropping off vegetable stock on their fence. You know, it was like those kind of things where it's not only like taking care of each other, but also making sure that you're like celebrating each other and being together when someone is sick, or organizing a memorial. For me, like, I think a lot of the older people that I'm friends with, you know, there is like a parenting that happens a little bit, but like it's almost back and forth that happens. Yeah, it's a little hard to talk about right now because I've had like 2 people pass away that I was very close to, who were older, and one person who is ill, and so a lot of it has taken this kind of role of caregiving. But you know, I think that there's like, you know, people showing up for all sorts of things, whether like they're coming to my studio and we're sewing a pair of like, I just sewed this pair of like 23-foot legs for one of my like good friends who was having a show, and we had a great time. And it's very international also. I don't know, I think those, I guess I'm not being articulate after like that very intense answer, but which is to say that like those like mutual aid kind of networks supporting each other, and particularly in terms of what's happening in the US now in terms of healthcare, like I access healthcare having to do with like my body that is going to be possibly outlawed on a federal level soon, you know? And I'm so happy that I had access to surgery when I did. I don't know if I'm gonna be able to get like hormones that I need. And which is to say that, you know, that legislation is, and that's been really important. Like right now I'm getting them without a doctor's prescription from a friend. And that might be something that happens more and more as we lose the rights over our bodies. So I think that those networks also work in that way. Yeah, it's been like my oldest queer friend I met when I was 13, and she was 21, and she was my like counselor at a fat camp for teenagers that my parents sent me to, and like we're still close friends. And I just made a piece about her that was in a museum. You know, it's like they take all shape and forms, but I think it's like not only survival, but like thriving together, making work together, collaborating, taking care, all those things.
Thank you.
Yeah, one final question.
Thanks for the brilliant presentation and very heartfelt share with all of us. Really appreciate that. And I think I have a question sort of emerging throughout the process. Is like, I understand that sort of like the way you use textile, both of you, is sort of like really sort of like a very anti-norm, and sort of like a very sort of wide male set up tradition sort of framework. So I think, so when we look back to the sort of like the showplace, you often got like with a museums or gallery space, it's like a white cube and a white wall. Do you recognize there's something maybe would be fitting better for like this type of textile work, like which is spoken about, like anything but this? Like, would it be better for like, you know, and also, do you think about where the work would be when you start making it? Do you imagine it's like empty space, like a wide space, or do you think about display on the movements, display on people, display in the community space?
I can, do you want me to? So, like, when I made the piece, can I go to it? Like this piece, The Queer Houses of Brooklyn, it's had like a really, really interesting journey, and I love to talk about it because, speaking of censorship, the Smithsonian had just had a show called Hide Seek that was looking at like canonical work, but in a queer context. And there was a piece by David Wojnarowicz that was like censored in that show, called Fire in the Belly. And I had like marched on the streets and written all these letters and had my students write letters. And I got a letter back from the Smithsonian, or I got an email from the Smithsonian, and I thought it was gonna be like, here's a receipt of your letter, we hear you, like bullshit letter. And it was like, we need a portfolio from you for like this show. And I was like, crap, like thanks for putting me in this position. And but it's got like really explicit work, way more explicit than what was like censored in the David Wojnarowicz thing. But it was really important to me to show this work in spaces that were like community-based before it went to that museum. So the first place it was shown was like for this fellowship that I had. We don't talk about that, but it was like this fellowship that I had. And then it went to an artist-run gallery called Grizzly in Philadelphia that's like literally in a blown-out building. It was like the size of a closet. I put the thing in the back of my car and drove it up there, like just like totally everything that horrifies conservators, and like nailed it to the wall. And then it was shown after that at AIR Gallery, which is a feminist cooperative, historic feminist cooperative in Brooklyn that has long shown like feminist work, people that aren't represented by galleries, people that aren't showing in museums. And that was a really cool thing for me because my sculpture professor, who had encouraged me a lot in textiles, was actually like part of the artists that belonged to the co-op, was actually on de-install duty. So we got to like de-install my work together, which meant a lot. And then it went to the Renwick in the Smithsonian. So it had been in like community spaces before that, even though it was going to them. And then it went to Queer Thread, so it was in Leslie Lohman, so like a specifically queer space. And then it's gone to like a bunch of places like Brooklyn Museum and for a really great queer show. So it's been really important to me to show in a lot of different places. Like I'll show work in the LGBT Community Center for their summer shows a lot, or the queer bookstore that's there. Like obviously I started climbing buildings, and that's how I started showing work. So for me, and then the other part is like I've done multiple projects where my work is in a museum, but there's an element that comes out of the museum and circulates in the population. And that's happened with like a number of pieces of mine. So a lot of it is like, I'm really into showing in museums because when I had art history, it was like they didn't even show women in my art history class, like art by women. So I was like, I'm gonna be in a museum and like fix this. So it is important for me to be in those spaces because I want to take up that space. But at the same time, like having the work circulate in the world always becomes, like a lot of times becomes part of it. And then the other thing that I really like to do is that if someone asks me to be in a show, I'm like, and these 4 other people are going to be working with me, and most of them don't have the kind of platform that I do. And so it's like opening the gate, giving them the key, and asking them to pass on the key. So I try to work a lot in that way. But yeah, I like showing in a lot of different kind of spaces. I've actually been putting work outside recently. So I just showed a light box piece outside in November, and I also, the piece about my fat camp counselor from when I was 13, like I dug up the museum sculpture garden rocks and like brought them all into the museum, and that piece doesn't exist anymore because it was all dismantled. So it was a lot about like bringing the outside of the museum into the museum and then out again. So yeah, conservators love me, like nightmare.
As for me, yeah, I think that space is something that is really important. I think value working within museums, especially if it's museums with free admission. I think that's something that I'm always thinking about as well. Is like in the United States, there's like this horrible idea that culture is really just for the elite. And so I think it's important to break down those ideas, and it's really for everyone and how the viewer can see themselves within the work. And I think that's also what's so important about textiles is that everyone has a relationship to it. So there's already this immediate connection that they have, and perhaps like that's their entry point of seeing something very familiar in an unfamiliar way. And then quite literally, we can look, but I've gotten to a place in my work now where everything is sort of like painted. Like this is at Arizona State University Art Museum in Tempe, Arizona. And so it's really been about these like huge like immersive installations, which initially when I was first starting out, I was like, I have to make everything. And it was like really ridiculous and completely unsustainable in terms of like my energy and the just amount of material. So really using like paint and vinyl has really sort of like unlocked a way for the space also to be taken over, and how also to kind of like change the mindset of the viewer. And like I think fantasy is something that I'm always trying to access, as well as just like choosing chaos and like breaking down these like extremely sort of like sterile, precious sort of environments and turning them into these like really intense spaces. But then because there's so much intensity, they like become something else as well. And so it's a way to sort of like mimic the textiles of what they are, as well as like mimic what they're not. And stripes have become something that's really important to me. There's this incredible book that's all about striped cloth. It's called The Devil's Cloth. And basically there's biblical text that talks about how one should not wear a cloth made of two. It's considered untrustworthy. And so from the medieval period onward, people who were on the fringes of society, be them prostitutes, poor people, jesters, were made to wear stripes. That's where we get the jail stripe, the American flag, etc. And so I think that stripes are obviously an important part for me to think about queerness and that like sort of marker that existed in the Bible as well as moving forward, but also this idea of like the forbidden and queerness within cloth itself. So it's about sort of like reappropriating these symbols, but then also taking over this space in its entirety and changing what it is, but also not changing it at all in that way.
Okay, I think we'll draw things to a close. I'd like to thank our speakers and our audience and our organisers. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph.